that would trigger his deep hatred for those of the opposite sex came when, while out with his friends at the age of 15, the group of both girls and boys paired off and headed to Lover's Lane. Christie was uncomfortable and couldn't perform with the girl he had been paired with. She berated him, and somehow word spread, and from then on he suffered constant name-calling and taunts from his peers. His anger simmered as he learned from a child to be quiet and secretive. He let it stew inside. At the age of 18 he joined the army. It was also at this time he began visiting women of the night. This was difficult for Christie. He'd been brought up by respectable parents, always being told to do the right thing by his father, and he knew how disgusted his mother would be if she knew. But here were these women who were not threatening, who would take his money and not judge him. In 1918, Christie's regiment was posted overseas. While in France, a mustard shell exploded close to where he was. It knocked him unconscious. He was returned home, and while in Newcastle Hospital, he lost his voice. Although it's thought to be from the gas, it was actually a condition called functional aphonia, brought on due to fright. Although it was deemed cured a few days later, it affected his voice forever. One of Christie's traits was his voice, his whispering tone, and that's creepy enough. Telling anyone that would listen, he told of his heroic time in the war, how he was gassed and he lost his speech, exaggerating the actual events. He told how the gassing left him without his ability to talk. He also added loss of sight, but that can't be proved. Realising he was getting the sort of attention he enjoyed, he went on to add more and more imaginary conditions to incite sympathy. Christie was demobilised from the army on the 22nd of October 1919. After a short spell in the Royal Air Force, he returned to Halifax. Christie looked for work. He found jobs in a cinema as a film operator. He also worked as a clerk at a wool mill. He wanted to settle down, but now he was home, he had no intention of putting himself through the mental torture he had experienced from the women he had once associated with, and who had mocked him, even though they were more to his taste. Instead, he met Ethel Simpson, a plain, down-to-earth young woman who was full of kindness. She was smart and thoughtful. He wasn't attracted to her in the intimate sense, but he liked her. She was safe. On May the 10th, 1920, he married Ethel at the Halifax Register Office. Less than a year into the marriage, he'd started to use working girls again and got arrested for theft. He had started work as a postman and stole some postal orders. He got sentenced to 9 months in HMP Manchester. Ethel stood by him. His family didn't. Christie was then convicted on the 15th of January 1923 of obtaining money on false pretences and of violent conduct, for which, respectively, he was bound over and placed on probation for 12 months. Things were spiralling out of control. His use of street workers had become known, and his marriage was on the rocks. Halifax wasn't a comfortable place for Christie to live. Ethel wanted to move to Sheffield to try again for a fresh start, but Christie wasn't having any of it, so he left her with her family and moved on. London. Once there, Christie needed to find work. He managed to scrape by with some clerk or bookkeeping work, but he soon went back to thieving. And he wasn't very good at it. He committed 2 further crimes of larceny during 1924 and received consecutive sentence of 3 and 6 months imprisonment. On the 22nd of September 1924 in HMP Prison, Wandsworth. His life was totally different now, spending nights with street workers and days scraping to make a living. He had no permanent home and mixed with some lowlifes and undesirables. Meanwhile, back in Halifax, Ethel had decided to move to Sheffield with her family. She got a job and lived a stable life. 1929 saw Christie back in prison, serving 6 months hard labour for hitting a working girl, Maud Cole, over the head with a bat. He had been living with her at the time. 1933, he was back inside after stealing a car from a Catholic priest he had become friends with. Some time after this, he and Ethel, who had visited him in prison, renewed their relationship. She seemed happy to go back to the man she married. Unfortunately, it would be a terrible mistake. Christie, it would seem, was just using Ethel, giving him the persona of a respectable, married, hard-working man, where in reality he was leading a double life. When Ethel went away visiting, he went back to his former life, frequenting the red light district. 1938, 10 Rillington Place, where, as we now know, John Christie would show just how dark and depraved he could be. It was the start of all things unholy, where lives would be taken in more ways than one. The old terraced house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. Close by was an underground train station where the noise from trains could be overwhelming. The Christies moved into the downstairs flat in the old deteriorating house that comprised of a living room, bedroom and kitchen. There was no bathroom, only a washroom that had to be accessed from outside, and an outside toilet that all the tenants in the house would use. At the end of the kitchen was an alcove that coal used to be stored in. The bottom flat, their flat, had use of the small rear garden. The flat on the floor above them was similar to theirs, but it was occupied by an elderly man, Charles Kitchener, who kept himself pretty much to himself and was rarely seen. The top floor flat was smaller, more of a bed sitting room and kitchenette. The top flat was empty when the Christies moved in. In 1939, Christie managed, because his records went unchecked, to become a special constable. This opportunity came about due to the force needing people during wartime. He stayed at Harrow Road Police Station for 4 years. His ability to deal with the criminal element earned him commendations. Apparently he revelled in his duties, earning him the nickname Himmler of Rillington Place. Oh, Lord. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, this position would also be abused by Christie. The police uniform gave him the ideal cover. He took bribes from the crooks and favours from working girls. The uniform gave comfort to women walking alone, and he knew it, giving him the perfect disguise and excuse to follow them. In the Blitz, it became apparent to him he had a fascination for dead bodies, and the position he was in gave him every opportunity to see them. In 1943, his career was in jeopardy after being caught and beaten by an irate husband of a woman he had started an affair with. His masculinity had once again used. Inwardly, he was mad and raging, boiling mad. August 1943. A young Austrian student nurse, Ruth First, who had started working the streets to supplement her small wage, went to Christie's home. According to Christie, he strangled her with a rope. He then hastily wrapped her leopard print coat around her and placed her body under the floorboards of the front room, cleaning the room quickly before Ethel returned that night. The next day, when Ethel and her visiting brother left, he took the body out in the wash house while he dug a grave in the garden. That night, into the garden to bury Ruth's body. The next day, he told Ethel he was burning rubber. This gave him the opportunity to burn Ruth's clothes. Nobody seemed to miss Ruth. Nobody even looked. Christie left the police at the end of 1943 and went to work for Ultra Radio. He became friendly with a female worker, Muriel Eady, a woman of good standing who had a boyfriend. Christie introduced the couple to Ethel, and they all became friends. Christie's devious, depraved mind had already planned the murder of Muriel. Now, while in the police force, Christie had gained a certificate in first aid. He somehow decided this gave him the same qualifications as a doctor. After some time, after gaining Muriel's trust, he carried out his plan. In Ethel's absence, he invited Muriel to the house with the lure of a device he had made to help her with her catarrh, a health problem that had been bothering her for some time. He told her of the device he had made, and she agreed to go to the house to see if it would help. He offered her a cup of tea, then showed her the glass jar he had altered. There were 2 holes in the jar with a rubber tube going into one hole. Muriel sniffed the tube. She could smell the friar's balsam that he'd put in it, but she didn't smell the gas that Christie had fed through the other tube into the jar. Now unconscious, Christie had his way with her, strangling her with a rope in the process. Once again, he dug a grave in the garden and buried Muriel close to Ruth. Christie was pleased with himself. This bold, ageing, unassuming, sickly man had killed 2 women, and nobody suspected him of doing such a terrible thing. After all, he was a respectable, quiet, nice man. Easter of 1948 saw a young newly married couple, Timothy and Beryl Evans, moving into the top bedsit of 10 Rillington Place. Now, after the war, the whole country struggled and poverty was rife. The small London bedsit was all the Evanses could afford at that time. Timothy Evans was 25 at the time, was a Welsh-born man. Around 1935, his family had moved to London. Timothy hadn't been the healthiest of children and had spent most of his young life in and out of hospitals due to an untreated verruca that had caused him some bigger health problems with his foot. The short time he did attend school, he felt ostracised by the other children. He really did seem to struggle at school. He hated London, so his mother allowed him to return to Wales, where he lived with his grandparents. His outlook changed when returning to Wales. He found the other children were in awe of the boy who had lived in the large city of London. He would make the most of this newfound status, telling them largely exaggerated stories of his life in London. When he left school, he went to work down the mines, but his foot ailments were to end his career. He eventually moved back to London to live with his mum and stepfather. After some failed jobs and struggling to find a decent job with his poor education, he could barely read all right. He landed a job at the toy factory his mother worked at. He was a young man trying to enjoy his life, going out to pubs and spending time with young women. Beryl Thorley was 18 when they met. She came from a respectable family and worked as a telephonist at Grosvenor House, Park Lane. They began seeing each other often and became engaged after a short time. They married on the 20th of September 1947. In 1948, Beryl found out she was pregnant. It was thought best for the couple to move on from the home they had been staying in with relatives, as the home was already overcrowded. Timothy and Beryl liked the Christies, but Thomas's older sister, Eileen, took an instant dislike to Reggie Christie. She saw him creep around silently, and his plimsolls and his low, whispering tone gave her the creeps. But the Evanses were happy with their nicely decorated little home. When they were offered a flat with more amenities in another area, they made the fatal decision of refusing to move. In October 1948, Beryl gave birth to a baby girl they named Geraldine, and they were very happy. Timothy's family doted on the baby and were happy to babysit when Timothy and Beryl went to the pictures once a week. Timothy was a doting dad, Beryl a loving mother. Although Timothy's job as a van driver kept him working long hours, travelling all over the country, he tried to be around as much as he could. But back home, Beryl was seemingly struggling. It's been said Timothy's family noticed the flat was always messy, and the baby, although well looked after, was sometimes unwashed. Rows began to finances coming in didn't cover the outgoing expenses. Timothy thought Beryl wasn't wise with the small wage of £7 they had coming in from his driving job. The rows became the norm in their rocky relationship. The neighbours would often hear them shouting, and the crashing of objects being thrown around the room could also be heard. Timothy would be locked out of their flat on a couple of occasions, leaving him raging. There were threats bandied around by both parties. These threats would be used against Timothy Evans at trial. When Beryl found out she was pregnant for a second time, she was adamant she didn't want this and was determined to end the pregnancy. We have to say apparently, as it's not really known what happened. Timothy was against this, apparently, but Beryl had made her mind up. Somehow Christie became aware of this. Firstly, he needed to convince the Evanses of his ability to help them. Christie spoke to the gullible Evans, telling him he had been trained as a doctor, and somehow he managed to convince Evans he could perform the operation to help them with their problem. Apparently, when Beryl heard of this, she unfortunately jumped at the offer. It's not entirely known what happened on Tuesday the 8th of November 1949. Apparently, the statement Timothy made at the police station is the version most people have gone by, as Christie's statements have many inconsistencies, so they've been used in conjunction with Evans. Evans woke that morning at his usual time of 6:30. He spent some time with Beryl and his daughter, and before he left, Beryl told him to tell Christie everything was okay, meaning he could go ahead. It would seem Christie went up to see Beryl around lunchtime. She lay on a quilt in front of the fire, as advised by Christie. He fastened a tube to the gas tap, telling Beryl it would make the process less painful. Beryl soon became drowsy. Christie was ready. His desire for this woman kicked in. He straddled her, but Beryl managed to shake him off and struggled with the man who now had the rope in his hands. She wasn't strong enough, and Christie took the life out of her. We have to stress there is no proof of this. After the murder, Christie heard someone on the stairs, then a knock on the door. It was Beryl's friend Joan Vincent. There was no response, and after trying the door, she realised someone was stopping it from opening. Didn't her friend want to see her? A little hurt, she left, passing Mrs. Christie on her way out. When Evans returned that evening, Christie stopped him, telling him of the bad news. Evans was apparently shocked to the core. He couldn't believe what had happened. He went to the room. She was laying on the bed of the dimly lit room. Christie had covered her with a duvet which hid the marks around her neck. Evans saw she was dead and noticed his daughter in the cot. After some time, a grieving Evans was told by Christie that Beryl's stomach had been septic poisoned. Evans didn't know any better, but he did know that a certain operation that had been performed was illegal. Although Christie would be arrested for manslaughter, Evans knew he would be an accessory, and Christie made a strong point of telling him that. Christie told him they must hide the body. The middle flat was vacant at the time, as the tenant was in hospital, so Christie put the body in there. Christie then went on to tell Evans he would dispose of the body down a drain. Evans was naturally concerned for his baby and wanted to take her to his mother's, but Christie told him it wasn't a good idea, as it would raise questions. The next morning, Christie told Evans he had found a nice couple who would look after his baby daughter. Evans knew he couldn't care for his daughter alone. Although he didn't seem to want to let her go, he felt he had to agree. He packed her belongings. The next day, he was told by Christie, horrifically, not to tell anyone where she or her mother was, just to tell anyone that asked they had gone on holiday to Beryl's father's home. On Thursday the 10th of November, Christie told Evans the couple were coming to fetch the child, so a reluctant Evans kissed his daughter before handing her over to Christie. That morning it's believed Christie went to the Evans' flat and took the child's life with a tie. He then, it's believed, placed her with her mother in a vacant flat. A short while later, a perplexed Joan Vincent went back to see Beryl. She had been worried about her last visit and wanted answers. On arriving, she was apparently stopped by Christie, who told her Beryl had gone to visit her father. Joan noticed, as she peered into the Christie's room through the open door, that Geraldine's pram and high chair were there. She questioned him. He replied he was asked to send them on to Beryl later. After questioning him some more, he got annoyed with her and more or less forced her out the door. Christie needed to get Evans out of the way. He feared he or his family would keep pushing as to where Beryl and the baby were. Evans had been sacked from his driving job. Now Christie had a way of ridding himself of this obstacle. He advised Evans to get rid of all he owned and leave and start afresh somewhere else. On Friday the 11th of November, the construction workers who had been working on the Rillington house had finished the work. They left the area they had been working on clean before they left. They helped the carpenter pull up some old floorboards that were rotten. Meanwhile, Evans went on to tell Joan Vincent about Beryl's departure. The reason he did this was because Christie had advised him to do so. He then made his way back to Wales to stay with his aunt and uncle. After a while he became desperate to see his daughter. He was rightly worried, and he made the decision to go back and see her. Turning up at Christie's door was a shock to Christie. He told Evans the child would need to settle in, and if he tried to see her, it would disturb her. Deflated and worried, he returned to Wales, telling his aunt and uncle Beryl had left him and Geraldine was living with a couple in Reading. After a couple of weeks, a concerned aunt called Evans's mum, asking if she knew Evans was staying with her and what he had said about Beryl and Geraldine. Evans's mother and sister were very concerned, as they knew Beryl wasn't at her father's, as they had telegraphed him earlier. This brought on a heated confrontation between Evans's family members and Christie when they turned up at Rillington Place, looking for answers. Mrs. Christie told them Beryl had left on Tuesday the 8th of November, saying goodbye as she left. But Christie raged that she had left without saying a word. Evans's sister knew one of them was lying. After a very nasty scene with harsh words from Christie about Evans, they left, hurt and angry, threatening police action as they left. Evans's mother was angry and distraught, not knowing what to do. She was also being hounded by people who Evans owed money to. Timothy Evans couldn't cope with the pressure he was now under, and on the 30th of November he walked into Merthyr Tydfil police station to give himself up. Detective Constable Evans looked at Timothy Evans, who told him, "I want to give myself up. I have disposed of my wife." Naturally, a shocked detective warned him to be careful what he said, but Evans replied He knew what he was saying and continued with, "I have put her down a drain. I can't sleep. I want to get it off my chest." The CID got involved and Evans told them a story they found hard to believe. It read, Evans met a man in a cafe that was going to help. He gave him some pills to give her that would get rid of the problem. When she took them, she died. Evans claimed he had carried her body in the early hours outside and put her head down into a drain. He found someone to look after his child and sold his furniture before moving back to Wales. The police called Notting Hill police station straight away, and they went straight round to Rillington Place. They found the manhole outside the Christies and checked the drain. It was empty. When they informed Evans of the news that the drain was empty, he was puzzled. When they told him he wouldn't have managed to lift the manhole cover alone, he realised Christie had lied to him. This is when he finally told them what many believed to be the truth. He told the police of what Christie had done and what he had told him to say to anyone who asked about his wife and daughter, and also the instructions he had advised him to follow. This included what he'd been told that had happened to his daughter. But of course, there was no proof of any murder. The next day, Detective Evans questioned when he last saw his wife's body. Evans explained her body was moved to the vacant flat below, and the detective asked him if he had helped Christie, and Evans replied that Christie had told him to stay in the flat, but he was having trouble moving her down the stairs, so asked him to help. They placed her body in the flat below, and that was the last time he saw his wife's body. Meanwhile, the Notting Hill police visited Evans's mother to find out where Beryl and the child was. She could only tell them what she'd been told by her son and Christie. They then went to 10 Rillington Place. They searched the flat, finding some clippings about a recent murder in a newspaper and a stolen briefcase. They also searched the Christie's place. They didn't check the washroom where Beryl and her baby were buried, nor did they notice any disturbance in the garden where 2 bodies were buried. A huge giveaway would have been the human bone propping up the fence post. Detective Inspector Black and Detective Sergeant Caulfield went to Wales to charge Evans with stealing the briefcase. So Timothy Evans returned with them to London. Christie was also requested to answer some questions at the Notting Hill police station. He was vehement about Evans, telling the police he would never do the things Evans had accused him of. He told them about the rows between Evans and Beryl. He told them his wife could verify all the things that had been said by Evans about his wife, how they could be physically aggressive towards each other. They had known about Beryl trying to rid herself of the baby problem and mentioned to her she looked ill and needed to be looked after. He even mentioned the friend Joan Vincent, who he claimed had inserted herself into the Evans's problems, making them worse, and how he had noticed Beryl had grown to dislike her. This was backed up by Mrs. Christie. The police now had to find Beryl and the child. Where were they? They knew they weren't at Beryl's father's house. They needed to check 10 Rillington Place again with a more thorough search. Looking through the rooms, they came to the dark and damp washroom. They couldn't see and had to use a torch. There was a stack of wood and planks propped up against the sink. Reaching around the stack, the policeman felt something that felt like cloth. They dragged it out. It was a tablecloth tied up with sash cord. Ethel Christie couldn't identify the rolled up material. She had no idea what it was. Taking the roll outside, they untied it. Beryl's feet were exposed. On further inspection of the wood stack, they found to their horror a smaller roll that contained the little body of Geraldine with the tie still around her. A horrified Evans was shown the bundle of clothes that Beryl was wearing, including the tablecloth and Geraldine's little bundle of clothes. They told Timothy Evans his wife and child had been found. Over 2 days of questioning, he gave his first of 2 statements. He said, "She was incurring one debt after another, and I could not stand it any longer. So I strangled her with a piece of rope and took her down to the flat below, the same night whilst the old man was in hospital. I waited until the Christies were in bed and then took her to the wash house after midnight. This was on Tuesday the 8th of November. He went on Thursday evening, after I came home from work, I took my child's life in the bedroom with my tie, and later that night I took her down to the wash house after the Christies had gone to bed." At a later date, this statement would be shown as false and possibly scripted. He mentioned locking the wash house door tight, but it was apparently impossible to lock it. He had never been in it, so he wouldn't have known this. The bodies couldn't have been there on the 8th, as the workmen who were working on the house were constantly in and out of the wash house. They kept their tools there and cleaned up after they left. The wood the bodies were found behind hadn't been taken up until after the 8th and were not placed there until the 14th, when the carpenter gave the wood to Christie. Although questioned, there was no statement taken from the carpenter at the time. But Evans repeated in a second statement that he had had a violent fit of temper over money while rowing with Beryl, and took some rope he had brought in with him from the van he drove and strangled her. He insisted it was on the 8th of November he had placed the bodies in the wash house. This was substantiated by the Christies, who claimed to have heard some noises coming from the flat above them that night. Evans was held at Brixton Prison leading up to his court date, and the prosecution scraped together as much evidence as they could. Evans's solicitors didn't do a very good job of defending his client. He didn't talk to the workmen, who could have cleared up a lot about the washroom, or talk with the carpenter. He didn't talk to a few witnesses that would have helped this case. He also did Christie's past crimes, when Evans finally pointed the finger at him. On the 11th of January 1950, Evans went to trial charged with the murder of his daughter and wife. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution relied heavily on the second statements Evans had made in the Notting Hill police station. Christie was the main witness. He played his part well, telling of the constant violent rows between the couple. When asked about the claims made about him, he told the court he had been suffering from fibrosis on the 8th and couldn't possibly have moved anything that day. He charmed the court with his stories from the war and volunteer policing, leaving the jury with the impression of a decent man. When Evans was called to the stand, he was asked when he first knew of his wife and daughter's death. He said he had first heard at the police station when he was shown the clothes. Asked why he had made the statements, he said he was very upset and believed the police would beat him up. He felt now his wife and daughter were both dead, he had nothing to live for. under cross-examination, he was made to look like a foolish man who had plenty of motive to kill his wife. The judge, on summing up, had very little sympathy for Evans and showed his admiration for the apparently sickly Christie, who had been injured in the war. On the 13th of January 1950, Timothy Evans was found guilty of the murder of Geraldine Evans and sentenced to death. Leaving the court, Evans's mother and sisters saw Christie and tearfully yelled, "Murderer! Murderer!" Ethel Christie shouted back, "How dare you? He is a good man." Evans would serve his time calmly, waiting for the day he would be hanged, and made sure his family knew he hadn't killed his wife and daughter. Timothy Evans was hung on the 9th of March 1950. After the trial, Christie went into a state of depression. He lost his job when his criminal record was brought to light at the trial, and he heard a few months later that 10 Rillington Place was up for sale. The only people now living in the house was the Christies. His fear of the 2 bodies being discovered by a new owner overwhelmed him. It wouldn't be hard to discover them, as the bones had started to resurface. Muriel Edie's femur had been propping up a fence post for most of the time, and now her skull had appeared. His answer to this was to dispose of it in a bombed-out house. Christie managed to deter some prospective house buyers, but it would be a surveyor's report of bedbug infestation and a long list of decaying areas that put most buyers off, to the relief of Christie. But eventually the house was sold and new tenants moved in. Christie managed to gain exclusive rights to the use of the garden. By now, the Christies' marriage was in trouble. They were not happy. He felt he needed time away from Ethel, but she wouldn't leave the house. They hadn't got on well with the new tenants, and tensions were rising. By spring 1952, Christie's anxiety had returned. They hated the new tenants. They no longer ruled the roost and became prisoners in their home, constantly under each other's feet. There was little affection for each other now, but Christie's bigger fear of being found out had affected his mental state more than anything else. He spent some time in hospital with a recommendation he spend some time in a mental institution for observation, which he refused, claiming his wife would be afraid to be alone in the house. In December, he would let loose the demon that had been fighting to be let free for some time. He handed in his notice at his job and went home to his wife. That night he strangled her in bed with a stocking. Her body lay in the bed for days before he wrapped her in a blanket, covered her head with a pillowcase, wrapped her in a silk nightgown, and buried her under the floorboards in the front room. His next problem was to make sure Ethel's family didn't suspect anything. So he wrote Christmas cards out claiming Ethel had rheumatism in her hands, so he'd wrote them for her. He was now able to live how he wanted and to do what he needed to do. His wife was gone, but he was struggling financially. He had her wedding ring and sold it. He sold off most of his furniture for a mere £12. He lived in 2 cold rooms with only a mattress, a table and a deck chair. He forged Ethel's signature to claim her savings of £10. And he lived off his unemployment pay of £2.04. But this didn't matter to him. His only need was his desire to be gratified. Ethel's body lay decomposing under the floor. The smell of Jay's fluid lingered in the air as he scrubbed the floor to help disguise the decay. Christie was now in his element. He had no one watching his every move. His pent-up needs burst into a frenzy of killing. He seemed to prey on vulnerable women he could subdue without a fight. Rita Nelson was a Northern Ireland woman living in London. She was apparently a drunk and convicted thief. She was lured back to Christie's rooms, although he claimed she followed him and abused him in the street, but it's believed he lured her there with the promise of helping her when she became pregnant. He followed his usual MO of strangulation with a rope, along with gratification. He then wrapped her up, as he had the others. He pulled out a cupboard in the kitchen and pushed her body inside the alcove. Rita was about 6 months pregnant. She was eventually reported missing by her landlady around the 19th of January 1953. Kathleen Maloney had met Christie in the weeks leading up to Christmas. She and another street worker had spent some time with Christie at his home. He took explicit photos of them and carried out some acts to them both. Kathleen would be another victim of Christie's when she went with him on another occasion. A drunk Kathleen sat in his deck chair. Forcing her to inhale the gas, he once again took her life with the rope, while also committing a act on her. He left her there and went to bed. The next day he wrapped her in the same way he had the others and forced her into the kitchen alcove behind the cupboard. 26-year-old Scottish-born Hectorina McLennan became his next victim. Christie had mentioned he could find her a flat where he lived. Of course, it was just a ploy to get her there. She turned up with her boyfriend, so she was spared that day, but he managed somehow to convince her to visit again. She made the unfortunate decision to go. She was killed in the same way as the others, with Christie's disgusting desires gratified. Christie didn't bother this time to wrap her in a blanket. He just bundled her into the alcove. Hectorina's boyfriend had come looking for her, but Christie managed to convince him he hadn't seen her. Christie's on the run. He had little money now and desperately wanted to go. He fraudulently let his flat to a young couple, Mr. and Mrs. Riley. They gave him £7, 13 shillings in advance, and he took off with a borrowed suitcase. When Charles Brown, the owner of the building, came to collect the rent from Christie, he was surprised to see the new tenants and told them to leave. A young man called Beresford Brown had been living in the flat that Evans had lived in. He'd got permission to use the kitchen connected to Christie's former rooms. He decided to put up some shelves, and while tapping at the wall he realised it sounded hollow, so there must be a room or a cupboard behind the wall that had been concealed. He pulled the wallpaper away and there was a small hole. He grabbed a torch and peered into the dark. He fell back when he saw a naked body. Yelling for help, another neighbour arrived. After he saw for himself what Beresford had seen, they called the police. The police made a thorough search of the house. They removed the bodies of the 3 poor women in the alcove and eventually found Ethel Christie's remains under the floorboards. When the garden was finally looked at, they discovered the remains of First and Edie. A nationwide manhunt for Christie was underway. His face was all over the front pages of newspapers, telling the public to be aware there was a serial killer on the loose. Christie, it would seem, had lost it. He just walked the embankments near Putney Bridge. A police officer, Constable Thomas Ledger, recognised him. Although Christie tried to give a false name, the officer knew it was him. Christie accompanied the police constable in a quiet, submissive manner back to the station. On the 31st of March 1953, Detective Inspector Kelly and Chief Inspector Griffin sat opposite Christie. He began his statement in his quiet, whispering voice, talking about his ill health, mentioning his enteritis, fibrosis and mental health. He claimed he woke up on the morning of the 14th of December to find his wife convulsing in the bed. He said he tried to help her, restoring her breathing, but it didn't help. He then went on with the delusion that he was helping his wife rest by getting her stocking and taking her life. He also tried to make out his wife had tried to unalive herself with his medication. This would be disproved by the coroner. The first person he mentioned in his statement was Rita Nelson, who he said was after his money and had attacked him, so he had to shut her up. Basically, or in his words, he couldn't remember what had happened. He must have lost it, as when he woke the next day she was dead in his deck chair. The rope was a handy thing to have close by, wasn't it? Kathleen Malone, he said, had come to look over the rooms with a view to taking them on from him. According to him, she thought her staying on for a few days would show the landlord she could be a trustworthy tenant. He emphasised the fact he didn't like the thought of that. He tried to make the point that she had offered herself to him as payment towards helping her. Obviously, he took the higher ground and refused. They fought, apparently, but he couldn't remember. He guessed he must have stopped her from fighting him. The next thing he knew, he was putting her in the alcove. Now, Christie, it's been said, was in a state of confusion. His mental health had declined. He'd been living more or less on the streets with little food. But with that in mind, he still claimed self-defence from the two women and was adamant he hadn't been involved with ladies of the night or offered help with unwanted pregnancies. And there was no proof that he had performed this procedure on anyone. He claimed, was the victim of violent, unscrupulous women. Hectorina McLennan he described as an accident. She had visited him earlier in the day with her boyfriend, but according to Christie, she returned later on her own and had demanded to stay with him. He had apparently tried to escort her out, but she fell limp. Now, it seems the term fell limp was used by Christie whenever he talked of the women dying. He then claimed to have helped her to the deck chair before putting her in the alcove. While in Brixton prison, Christie changed. He became more aware, more confident. He was now in a routine with regular meals. He seemed to be enjoying the tension he was receiving that sometimes comes along with the tag serial killer. There had been no mention of the death of Beryl Evans, and why would there be? They'd caught the man responsible. At least they thought they had. Until Christie, while talking to a psychiatrist in prison, confessed that it was him who had killed Beryl. But of course he felt really bad about that. On June the 5th, his confidence was strong when Kelly and Griffin visited him for a statement on the findings of Ruth First and Muriel Edie in the garden of Rillington Place. On Ruth First, he once again put the blame on the woman. She had wanted him to have relations with her. When he found out his wife was due home, he asked her to leave. But he did have relations with her and admitted being responsible for her demise, but always made the excuse that the woman had instigated it, and he had no choice. Muriel Edie had visited Rillington Place at the request of Christie, and for the first time he admitted to using the tube and gas to make her sleepy, and once again couldn't recall all the details but thought he may have had relations with her when he pulled the rope around her neck. Apparently, all the women found in the alcove had carbon monoxide present in their blood. Their deaths were due to asphyxia with carbon monoxide poisoning. Marks were found around their necks and semen found inside all but Mrs. Christie. Mrs. Christie had no signs of phenobarbital inside her system, as Christie had claimed she had tried to unalive herself. On the 8th of June, he finally confessed to Kelly and Griffin about the death of Beryl Evans. His version being that Beryl had wanted to end it all because of Timothy Evans, her husband, beating her. So after she had begged him to help her, he had refused, But later, when going up to her flat and seeing her failed attempt to unalive herself, he decided to carry out her wishes. According to Christie, she had offered relations with him as a thank you, and he admitted to having his way with her when he carried out the deed with the rope. This was one of 4 confessions he made about Beryl's death. He told it differently each time. The claims have often been disputed and discussed, and Christie claimed on more than one occasion that he couldn't be sure if he killed them or not. It's complicated stuff, and it doesn't help that Christie kept changing his story. He would never admit to taking the life of Geraldine Evans, the innocent young child of Beryl and Timothy. He couldn't stand the thought that people would see him as a child killer. In his eyes, he was just the killer of women. Other than that, he was a decent man. While searching Rillington Place, the police found a tin containing pubic hair. They didn't match any of the women, so where did they come from? Nobody knows. Even Christie played dumb. So could there be others? He claimed there could be, but he wasn't sure. Christie had been seen by doctors to ascertain his competence. It became clear to them that Christie seemed to want them to class him as insane, and had been heard mentioning the thought that Broadmoor had appealed to him, as he had heard people there were happy. At the trial, Christie claimed to have killed Beryl, but Timothy Evans had disposed of the body. He claimed insanity for the killing of his wife. The defence would rely heavily on the insanity claim. He admitted 6 other killings, but not Geraldine's. This, they claimed, was to prove the man was mad. Dr. Hobson said that he believed Christie knew what he was doing when he killed Mrs. Christie, but didn't know he was doing wrong. He also believed Christie was suffering with false memories, where his mind would retain certain memories, but he couldn't put them in the right place. The Attorney General, Sir Lionel Heald, was adamant that Christie had known exactly what he had done was wrong, as he had hid her under the floorboards and tried to maintain she was still alive to her family by sending Christmas cards signed by him as her, and took her money out of the bank fraudulently. When asked if he would have killed her if a policeman was present, Christie replied no, he wouldn't, showing he obviously knew what was right and wrong. Dr. J.C. Matheson, Principal Medical Officer at Brixton Prison, saw Christie as a weak man who at times tends to exaggerate and act in an hysterical manner. He didn't have hysteria, but would act hysterically in certain circumstances. Psychiatrist Dr. D. Curran said Christie was somewhat emotional but settled down quickly. He was tidy in his person and habits. He kept himself occupied and mixed freely with others. He had been noticeably egocentric and conceited. He kept a photo of himself in the cell. He was a great talker and seemed to enjoy talking about his case. Even if the conversation wasn't about it, he would make sure to turn the conversation back to it. He added, he has a remarkable capacity for dismissing the unpleasant from his mind. The defence urged the jury to bring in a verdict of guilty but insane. The prosecution stated they had proved Christie deliberately killed his wife and knew exactly what he was doing. He stressed that a perversion was not proof of insanity. Justice Finemore spoke, saying just because a man acted like a monster does not mean he is insane. He spoke for a good 2 hours. The jury retired, and about 85 minutes later they returned a verdict of guilty of murder and sentenced to death. On the 15th of July, John Reginald Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison by Albert Pierpoint. When the rope went around Christie's neck, he said to Albert Pierpoint, "My nose itches." Pierpoint told him not to worry, it wouldn't bother him for long. On the 6th of July 1953, the then Home Secretary set up an inquiry looking into the case of Timothy Evans. As Christie had admitted to the death of Beryl Evans, the convictions of Mr. Evans was deemed unsafe. But the inquiry was held in private. Many people were spoken to, and at the end they still found Evans guilty of killing both his wife and child, and a confession from Christie unreliable and untrue. People were outraged on all sides. The arguments on the Evans case went on, and I guess still does. In 1965, Sir Daniel Braben, a High Court judge, reheard the case. It took 30 days to cover, and in 1966 the report was published. They found that it was more probable that Evans killed his wife but not his daughter. And because he was charged with the death of his daughter, he was given a pardon. His family were allowed to exhume his body and have it buried in consecrated ground instead of laying in the prison grounds. In January 2003, the Home Office awarded Evans' sister and half-sister compensation for the miscarriage of justice in Evans' trial. For the murder of his daughter was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice. Lord Brennan QC said, "There is no evidence to implicate Timothy Evans for the murder of his wife. She was probably murdered by Christie." But what we do know for sure is Christie killed 6 women, possibly more. Who knows? He had a waxwork figure in Madame Tussauds' now defunct Chamber of Horrors. There are numerous books, films and TV shows based on the case. Christie's demeanour and seemingly emotionless stare was disturbing to those who came across him, and rightly so, as hiding behind his pretentious persona was something far more terrifying. Harvey Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan in 1862. In 1884 he graduated from Cleveland Homeopathic Medical College. Over the next 12 years he practiced as an ear and eye specialist across various states in the US. In 1887 he married Charlotte Bell in San Diego. A year later, Crippen and Charlotte had a son, Otto Hawley Crippen. Unfortunately, his wife died of a stroke in 1892 while living at Salt Lake City. He was now alone with a young son, and when he was offered a job with Dr. Munyon's, a homeopathic pharmaceutical company based in New York, he thought it best to leave his son in the care of his parents and take the job. While there, he met and married Cora Turner, a young 17-year-old singer whose ambition was to tread the boards in the music halls, going by the stage name Belle Elmore. Her friends had encouraged her to try, but she wasn't seen as good enough. Crippen also encouraged her and indulged her with singing lessons. She was bright, cheerful and feisty. She was a good-looking, vivacious woman with dark eyes and long flowing black hair. It was also claimed she was rather promiscuous, as it was claimed at the time of them meeting and forming a relationship she was also a mistress to another man. Crippen was a total opposite of Cora, being a small, slightly built, pale-looking man with a receding hairline and large moustache. He had dark eyes that looked at you through rimmed glasses. By all accounts, he wasn't what they would call a man's man. Regardless, they married in 1887 and moved to St. Louis. It was while there Crippen discovered his wife's real name wasn't Cora Turner, but Kunigund Makamotze. Apologies for name mispronunciation. She was born to Russian and German parents. Crippen and his wife moved to England in 1900. This was Crippen's second time in the UK. The first was in 1883, when at the age of 21 he attended various hospitals in London as part of his education in medicine. Crippen's later move to London was as a manager for Munyon's advertising business in patent medicines, and it was based in Shaftesbury Avenue. He also started working as a dentist. Cora, still determined to be a singer on stage, tried the English music hall scene. Didn't go as well as she had hoped, but Crippen was happy to pay for her pretty gowns and jewellery. But after a while it became apparent she wasn't going to realise her dream of fame. She still appear at times on stage, taking what she could get, and it would seem she'd resigned herself to that. They continued to follow the entertainment circles, and Cora became a member of the Women's Music Hall Guild. Crippen was happy to be by his wife's side as she entertained a small circle of friends, and he would often be seen giving her pieces of jewellery. They did form some good friendships, one being with fellow American music hall performer Clara Martinetti and her husband Paul. They dined and played whist regularly, and spent many hours talking about their love of music and dance. In 1905 they rented a small semi-detached house in a quiet, leafy part of Camden Town, number 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Life, it would seem, went on rather normally for the residents of Hilldrop. To the outside world they seemed to have a good marriage, although it was being disputed with claims that he was henpecked by Cora and she flaunted lovers in front of him. Also not proved. It would come to light that the Crippens did have some domestics, and it was witnessed by a then boarder at the home. It was apparently stated to be one-sided, and that Cora chided her husband on more than one occasion. It was around this time Crippen had formed a bond with a pretty young secretary, Ethel Neve. She was quiet and reserved, a total opposite of Cora's outward character. She became his escape from home life, enjoying the companionship she gave him. She had become his constant companion every day, not only with his work life but also outside of it. His friends and work colleagues seemed to know about the closeness of the couple, as Crippen didn't try and hide it at all. There was a storm a-brewing. Allegedly. Crippen's life at home was by all accounts argumentative. He felt demeaned by his wife. The extravagant lifestyle they tried to show outwardly wasn't reflected in the home, as they were living as cheaply as they could. The extravagance they portrayed was a smokescreen to the reality of it. And the passion for Miss Leneve was growing, and that passion, along with the theory that if she had just left him, she would have taken all of her expensive clothes and jewellery that he'd paid for and saw them as his possessions as much as they were his wife's. But if she were to cease to exist, he'd have the best of both worlds, and this would be the prosecution's official theory as to why Crippen would take the life of his wife. In February 1910, Cora Crippen went missing when her friend Clara Martinetti, who was apparently the first person to find her disappearance suspicious, inquired about Cora's absence. Crippen responded that she had to return to America as an emergency had arisen. After a few weeks of no correspondence from Cora, Clara grew more concerned and once again asked Crippen about Cora's whereabouts, stating that she hadn't heard anything from her friend, which she found odd. Dr. Crippen, she noted, was always evasive when it came to Cora and would only respond that she was fine. Cora's other close friend Lillian Nash, known on stage as Lil Hawthorne, also found this suspicious, especially when told later Cora had died while in America. As Mrs. Hawthorne and her husband John Nash were good friends of the superintendent Frank Frost, they went to see him on the 30th of June 1910. Cora had been missing for nearly 5 months by this time. They relayed their suspicions regarding the whereabouts of Cora Crippen. After hearing what they had to say, he instructed Chief Inspector Walter Dew, a highly regarded man who had been one of the policemen hunting for Jack the Ripper, to listen to what the Nashes had to say. He learned that they had returned to London after an American tour to hear their good friend had passed away. They spoke of Crippen's work, how he was in a partnership with an American dentist, Dr. Rylance, and his managerial role with Munyon's mail-order medicine company. They went on to say how they heard from Dr. Crippen that Cora had returned to America on February the 2nd and passed away there on the 23rd of March. But they had noted there had been cheques signed by her in that time. A doubtful Dew didn't think anything untoward would come from this case, so he went to interview members of the Women's Guild. All the statements he collected said almost the same thing, how they had been told by Dr. Crippen she had gone to America in response to an emergency. They then all received a black-edged letter informing them of Cora's passing. The Martinettis told Dew about their own suspicions and how they were piqued all the more when they saw Crippen at a benevolent fundraising with his secretary. And after more inquiries, Crippen eventually told them his wife Cora was ill, but he had been told not to worry. A few weeks later, he informed the Martinettis that Cora had died of pneumonia in America. He told them she would be cremated and her ashes sent back to London. It would also be found in the inquiries that the very day Cora allegedly went to America, on February the 2nd, Crippen entered Attenborough's pawnbroker's shop, asking for a loan against a diamond ring and earrings. He agreed to an £80 loan. Just a week later, Crippen pawned some more diamond jewellery for £115. Chief Inspector Dew spoke to the landlord of 39 Hilldrop and learned that Crippen had told his landlord on March the 15th that he would be leaving to move back to America, as he had inherited a home there. Dew also heard that Crippen had stayed in Dieppe with Leneve under the names Mr. and Mrs. Crippen, after he told Cora's friends she had passed. Chief Inspector Dew decided to need to speak to Crippen himself. After investigating, Dew went to Hilldrop Crescent on the 8th of July. On arriving at the home, he and D.S. Arthur Mitchell found Crippen's young maid in the house. After a few minutes, Ethel Leneve came down the stairs and joined them. They found Leneve to be unhelpful, and she told them in no uncertain terms that Mr. Crippen wasn't home. Dew then demanded she take him to see Crippen. When Crippen saw, the inspector explained to him his wife's friends were not satisfied with what he'd told them about his wife's disappearance, and that after making inquiries he also wasn't satisfied. Crippen replied, "I suppose I'd better tell the truth. The stories I had told them about her death were untrue. As far as I know, she is still alive." He then added that he didn't want people asking any more questions about his wife, as he found it embarrassing to admit she'd left him. So he then made a statement which was taken down by Sergeant Mitchell. He, Crippen, went to America from November to June, and when he came back he found that an American music hall artist named Bruce Miller had been a frequent visitor to their house. She had told him that this man had taken her about, and that he was very fond of her, and she of him. Crippen said that he had seen the letters to his wife from Bruce Miller ending with love and kisses to Brown Eyes. When his wife came to England from America, her manner towards him had changed, developed a most ungovernable temper, and seemed to think he was not good enough for her. She boasted of a man in a good position who had made a fuss of her. He never saw the man Bruce Miller, but Miller called when he was out and took her out in the evening. She and the prisoner, Crippen, continued to live together, apparently happy, but there were frequent occasions on which she got into a violent temper. She often threatened to leave him, saying she had a man she could go to. Sometime after this, he ceased to cohabit with her, but never interfered with her movements. They were of no interest to him. On January the 31st, Mr. and Mrs. Martinetti came to their place for dinner, and after they had left, his wife abused him and said she would not stand it any longer. She would leave him the next day, and he would not hear of her again. He claimed to be ashamed of this and wanted to try and cover up the scandal this would cause him. He admitted he had lied about his wife being ill and dying, and that Miss Leneve had been his mistress for 3 years. He also admitted to not disposing of belongings his wife had left behind. He believed she had gone back to America to be with Bruce Miller. According to this statement, he and Cora were practically living separate lives. He went on to add that he didn't know what clothes his wife had or hadn't taken with her. He believed she had taken a travel bag, as one was missing, and maybe most of the jewellery, but leaving behind 3 diamond rings and a diamond brooch. He also claimed to have only given her medication to help with her bilious attacks. As for the signed cheques, he claimed she had signed some blank cheques before she left. He admitted Leneve had worn some of Mrs. Crippen's clothing and jewellery, but on Ethel Leneve he admitted she was now living with him as his wife. When the inspector asked about contacting someone who may know the whereabouts of Mrs. Crippen, responded with the name of her sister, Louise Mills, who lived with her husband in Brooklyn, but couldn't help with any trace of where his wife could be, only that he presumed she was with Mr. Miller. Crippen had taken his time giving his statement, as he continued to work through the entire interview. The inspector noted that he showed no sign of guilt or signs of nervousness. He was calm and polite. And at this time the inspector had no reason or thought of a crime having been committed. He was just trying to clear up what may have happened to Mrs. Crippen, and possibly find some evidence of where she may have gone. Dew wasn't totally satisfied with the statement Crippen had just given. According to Dew, Crippen was very convincing, leaving him to add later that the doctor was an accomplished liar, and, with that slight niggling doubt in the inspector's mind, and knowing how well this man had lied to those around him, he knew he had to look further into the disappearance of Mrs. Crippen. The inspector and the DS then interviewed Ethel Leneve. She admitted to having moved into 39 Hill Drop at the end of February, and that she had been intimate with Mr. Crippen for about 2 to 3 years. but had known him for about 10 years, and she was employed as a typist by the same company. She told how she had known Mrs. Crippen and saw her as a friend. This would be disputed, as Cora had mentioned to a friend that she disliked the typist at her husband's office and had asked him to have her removed, but he declined, telling her the typist was valuable to the company. Leneve went on to say Mr. Crippen had sent a note informing her that Mr. Crippen had gone back to America in early February and asked her to hand over a package he had enclosed with a letter to a Miss May. Peter arrived at Albion House and gave Ethel all the information on his wife's packing and going to America. She admitted to attending a function with Crippen and wearing the diamond brooch that she says he gave her. It was later that Crippen had informed her that his wife had caught a chill on the boat that turned into pneumonia. She would also, although slightly uncomfortably, admit to staying in Dieppe with Crippen as man and wife. It was when they returned to Hildrop that he informed her that his wife was dead. Crippen gave her his wife's furs and she moved in with them, telling everyone she was his housekeeper. The inspector, DS, Leneve and Crippen all returned to the house on Hildrop Crescent, so the inspector could search through some of Mrs. Crippen's belongings and papers to see if they could shed some light on her whereabouts. The inspector and DS searched all the rooms, noting that nothing seemed out of place that they could see. They then went out to the garden. Nothing looked disturbed. Then the coal cellar. Dust lay on the brick floor that made it seem that it hadn't been touched for some time. Crippen and Leneve watched as the two policemen searched, but came up with nothing. Inspector Dew asked Crippen if he could help with anything that may lead to finding where his wife had gone, and Crippen seemed happy to help, suggesting placing adverts in newspapers, which he didn't do. On leaving, Dew turned to Crippen and told him he would need to contact Mrs. Crippen to clear this whole matter up. A description of Cora Crippen was circulated as a missing person the day after the interview. A few months went by. On Monday the 11th of July, Chief Inspector Dew and DS Mitchell went to Albion House to talk with Crippen, only to find both Crippen and Ethel Leneve were not there. Crippen's partner, Dr. Rylance, showed them a letter he had received from Crippen. In it stated, "In order to escape trouble, I have been obliged to absent myself for a time." They were gone. Dew and Mitchell went straight round to 39 Hildrop Crescent, and this time searched the house thoroughly. In the bedroom wardrobe, to their surprise, a revolver and cartridges was found, but Dew knew it hadn't been there before on the first search. This alarmed Dew. An innocent man wouldn't run. This time his search went further. He doubled down on his examination of the rooms, including the cellar, and dug up the garden, but they didn't find anything. He did fail to notice Cora's furs were still hanging in the house. Wouldn't she have taken them with her, as it was the middle of winter? After Inspector Dew spoke with one of Crippen's work colleagues, William Long, at a later date, he discovered that on 9th of July, the day after the first visit from the police, Crippen had asked Long to buy some boys' clothes and gave him instructions of what to buy. A puzzled Long asked why. Crippen responded he was trying to avoid a small scandal. Crippen and Leneve had left around 1 p.m. Just as surprising to Dew was that he discovered Leneve had been telling everyone she knew, including her parents, that she was married to Crippen and had been since Cora's death. They were on the run. What for was still to be determined. A description of the two was circulated to all ports. 39 Hildrop Crescent was now empty, meaning Dew and Mitchell could delve deeper into what secrets, if any, there would be hidden in the house. In Dew's own words, he declared, "Let's go and have another look at that cellar." On our hands and knees we probed at the brick floor with a poker. After a while the sharp end of the poker found its way easily between two bricks, and one lifted. The brick came out, then another, and so on. Mitchell ran to get a spade from the garden. With this I worked steadily for a few minutes, then came to the evidence nauseatingly unmistakable. The stench was unbearable, driving us both into the garden for fresh air. What they discovered was human remains covered in lime, but the lime was so wet it didn't destroy the remains, but preserved them. Found along with the remains was a curling pin with hair attached, a piece of ladies' underwear, and a piece of a man's pyjama shirt, a rotted handkerchief knotted at two ends, and a piece of string. Just as shocking was the absence of a head, bones, arms, legs, and organs. Were they looking at what remained of Cora Crippen, aka Belle Elmore? The local divisional doctor, Thomas Marshall, was called, and the assistant commissioner of the CID was informed. The doctor checked the remains and noted that they looked as if they had been dumped into the hole. He would make a better evaluation once they were removed to the mortuary. The next day the body was removed and Dew continued to search. He found under the bed a box that contained 2 sets of pyjamas. More importantly, 1 odd pair of bottoms. Dew, convinced the remains were those of Cora Crippen, secured a warrant for the arrest of Harvey Crippen and Ethel Clara Leneve for the murder of Cora Crippen. As Dew continued his investigation, the news was breaking. People were shocked to hear the news of what might have happened to Mr. Crippen's wife and the terrible, gruesome findings in the house. The papers found work colleagues and friends of Crippen, and interviews showed the depths of their shock and surprise at the news. But where was Crippen and his female companion? It was feared that the couple had tried to leave the country, so cablegrams were sent out to many countries giving a full description of the wanted two, stating that they were wanted in connection to the murder and mutilation of a woman. They gave the names Harvey Crippen, aka Peter Crippen, alias Frank, and a full physical description, and that Ethel Leneve possibly travelling as his wife. Newspapers also had the full wanted description all over the country and abroad. At the coroner's inquest, the coroner, Dr. George Danford Thomas, explained to a packed room that they believed the found remains were those of Cora Crippen, but further investigation needed to be done. But the police had it in hand. Dew gave his evidence and assured the court that they had a full-on search for Crippen and Leneve, and Dr. Thomas gave Dew high praise for his findings. Dr. Marshall then told of his findings from the post-mortem. So far he had determined that the remains belonged to a female, but because the body had been grotesquely mutilated, it was difficult to tell absolutely. He also believed that the body had been dissected in the cellar where it was found, adding that whoever did this took their time. The problem they had now was to determine absolutely that the remains were those of Cora Crippen. A bit of luck landed in Dew's lap when he overheard Clara Martinetti mention that Cora had a large scar on the lower part of her body. Dew knew this as a definite that a piece of skin found had the trace of a large scar on it. As the investigation moved forward, Crippen's respectable mask started to slip. The small, unassuming man had skeletons in his closet. The brother of his first wife told of some letters he had received from his sister suggesting that Crippen had got into trouble using his medical teachings. He had often passed himself off as not only a dentist, but an optician and possibly other medical doctors. The brother believed he may have been responsible for his sister's death. His sister had claimed he had forced her to have operations that were performed by him, that he wasn't qualified for. The letters had been passed on to the police, but nothing happened. The more they heard, the more they grew concerned that Crippen might slip through their fingers. The police pushed for all letters going to the friends and families of the two to be intercepted, thinking they might try to contact them under different names. If they were still in the country, they had to be laying low or in a disguise of some sort, as they were both now all over the newspapers. The story of the crime and the horrific discovery, found in 39 Hilldrop Crescent, was definitely front page news. On July the 10th, 1910, the runaway couple had managed to reach Brussels and signed into a hotel as Canadian John Robinson and his son, John Jr. John Jr. was Ethel and Eve, dressed as a boy. They remained there for about 8 days. While there, Crippen booked a passage to sail to Canada on the Montrose, leaving on the 20th of July. All the ships leaving London after the discovery of the body had been given a detailed description of the couple, and added that they may be in disguise, especially the woman, who may be dressed as a man. It was also announced in the newspapers. The Montrose had just left England before reaching Brussels. Captain Kendall greeted his travellers before spending some downtime reading a newspaper. His interest was piqued reading about the horrific crime that had been committed in England, and the 2 wanted suspects were on the run and possibly trying to travel overseas. He noticed he had 2 people on board that he thought looked suspicious. Kendall decided to keep his eye on the pair, as he wasn't totally sure and didn't want to make a mistake. After spending time in the company of the Robinsons, and after some conversations with the older man, who he noted hadn't responded to his new name Robinson on more than one occasion, Captain Kendall felt confident he had the 2 suspects on board. A wireless telegraph shipped ashore was sent to his shipping company, who would pass on the message to Scotland Yard. When Scotland Yard heard the news, Inspector Dew was booked onto a faster steamship and arrived at an outpost a few days before the Montrose. It was all done cloak and dagger style in London, trying to avoid the press. When the Montrose arrived on the 31st of July, Dew, with the help of the Canadian police, boarded the Montrose in disguise of his own. Mr. Robinson was requested to go to the captain's cabin, where Dew formally arrested Crippen for the murder and mutilation of his wife Cora in London on or around 2nd of February. When searching Crippen, a note was discovered claiming that he was going to unalive himself by jumping into the sea, as the horror of it all had become too much. This was a cover, as Crippen had claimed a quartermaster had offered to help him escape by pretending to hear a splash, then hide him until it was safe. The story wasn't believed. Crippen requested Leneve be let go, as she hadn't done anything and knew nothing of what had happened. They were both arrested and returned back to England once extradition papers had been acquired. On returning, Crippen and Ethel were taken to court to be placed on remand with a court date to be set. Leneve, it was thought, would only be charged with aiding and abetting. This whole case had captured the world's interest. Those involved said they had never seen anything like it before. Dr. Crippen had captured the interest of the public. People wanted to know how this unassuming man, who was said to be a good, mild man, could turn into this monster, killing his wife in a horrific way. They wanted all the grisly details, not just of the murder, but of Crippen's life and the other woman. On the 6th of September, the magistrates' court continued, with medical evidence being produced by Dr. Pepper. Pepper started with, quote, "His first impression was that the remains in situ roughly corresponded in shape, breadth and length with an adult body. He came to the conclusion that they were from a human in the prime of life and stout of build." He went on, "The remains bore the signs of an old operation in the form of a scar. A poison trace was detected in the body parts that was given to Dr. William Wilcox, and he determined the poison was hyoscine. Hyoscine was usually given to quieten someone suffering from some form of delirium. Dr. Wilcox thought whoever had given the fatal dose must have given a very large dose for it to still be present in the body after such a length of time. He went on to say that the large amount of poison in the intestines indicated that it had been taken by mouth, and the person would have lived for an hour or more before succumbing to the effects. He went on to add that the poison would put the person into a stupor and possibly make them delirious. They would then become paralysed and comatose before death. It had been discovered that on January the 19th, Crippen had bought a large dose of hyoscine, and there didn't seem to be any work-related reason for him to have needed this. The next day at the coroner's court, Dr. Pepper gave a more in-depth description of his findings on the body parts that were found. He mentioned the remains were more than likely mutilated by someone who had some form of knowledge about the human or animal anatomy. What was left of the body was mostly fat and muscle. The skeleton had been removed, the limbs and head also removed and never found. The full statement from leading surgeon Augustus Pepper gives explicit details of the horrific find. 2 days later, Dew answered some questions at the court. He told of how his initial first visits to Dr. Crippen's office was just to get some information regarding his wife's alleged disappearance. On hearing what Crippen had to say, he didn't feel satisfied with his statement, so came to the conclusion he needed to investigate further. A few days later, the magistrate came to his decision. Sir Albert Rutson concluded that Crippen should stand trial for the charge against him. Crippen was charged that on the 1st of February he had murdered his wife, Cora Crippen. It was decided that the evidence against Leneve was enough for her to go to trial as complicit to knowing of the murder but not involved in the act. Both Crippen and Leneve would plead not guilty and be tried separately. In the meantime, the investigation continued. Arthur Miller was eventually found by the Pinkertons agency. He was now a married man with 2 children and hadn't heard from Cora since she sent him a Christmas card in 1909. He explained in his statement that he made at the Pinkertons' office that he and Cora, Miss Elmore, were best of friends. He added that he thought it odd that Crippen had even mentioned she would have eloped with him, as he hadn't seen her for at least 6 years and had been living in America for 4 of those, and that Dr. Crippen would probably have known this, as Cora had never hidden the friendship from her husband. There was never any sort of relationship between them. They were good friends with similar interests in the music world. Back in London, as the coroner clearly stated, they were the remains of Cora Crippen and they had no further need of them. Cora Crippen could be buried. The Women's Guild held a private funeral and Cora Crippen was buried at St Pancras Roman Catholic Cemetery in Finchley. October the 18th, 1910, saw the trial of Dr. Harvey Crippen opening, with presiding judge Lord Chief Justice of England, Richard Webster. Representing the Crown were Richard Muir, Travis Humphreys and Samuel O'Day. Representing Crippen was Alfred Tobin, Huntley Jenkins and Henry Roome. A picture of how the murder might have happened was drawn and told to the courts by the prosecution, where they told how, and quote, Belle Elmore, Cora Crippen, had always been partial to a drink of stout when undressing at bedtime. Crippen, they said, bought a glass of stout to her, but in the stout he had added some hyoscine. It is a deadly poison, inducing convulsions and coma preceding death. Belle, Cora, drank the stout and Crippen undressed. By the time she went into a coma, Crippen was in his pyjamas. He seized his wife's hair and dragged her out of the room and down the stairs. She still had on her underwear. All this was according to plan, for the crime had been premeditated. The grave he had dug was waiting under the coal cellar's floor. He dragged the body into the kitchen and onto the table. According to the version being read out, Crippen then used his knives and scalpels to remove her head. How he disposed of the head they didn't know. The head was gone. He then dissected the body as only someone with surgical training could know how. The rest of the description was very graphic, painting an horrific picture in the minds of the jury, telling of how the skin was removed from the bones and how the remains were dragged or carried to the grave in the pyjama top. He told of one piece of flesh that bore a scar about 8 inches long that was found in the grave, along with some clumps of hair, underwear and the pyjama top. Lime was sprinkled over the contents of the grave before filling the hole in with topsoil and placing the bricks carefully on top. Then he smeared the coal dust on top. Where he had hidden the bones they didn't know, but they surmised he later burned them in his back garden. Odie then added that, as for the gunshot that had been reported, he believed that after Crippen had given Cora too much hyoscine after the dinner party, she passed. He was going to tell the doctor he believed it was her heart. A post-mortem would show a fatty heart, and witnesses would agree Cora had eaten and drank a lot that night. A doctor would not notice the poison as it was untraceable. But Cora became hysterical and began screaming, so he shot her in the head, hence the reason it was missing. The follow-up story of his wife going to America was put together after the initial premeditated murder story. The motive being he wanted to be with Miss Leneve and had no money of his own. The death of his wife would allow him to be with Miss Leneve, and after selling his wife's belongings, he would be more financially able to provide for her. After the dinner party on the 31st with the Martinettis, Cora wasn't seen or heard from again. He moved Miss Leneve in shortly after. After about 3 days, Bruce Miller was put on the witness stand. He told how he and Cora had been friends for some years, but he hadn't seen her since 1904. They still corresponded as friends. When cross-examined, he told how he had thought fondly of her and her of him, but they were married people and that meant more to them. Their relationship was no more than friendship. Dr. Pepper was next, stating that the body had something that was interesting, a mark on the abdomen that appeared to be a scar, more importantly an old scar. He concluded that the remains had been buried for at least 4 to 8 months and stated that it was quite impossible that they were buried there before September 1905. They also found some bleached blonde hair strands and pieces of a pyjama jacket that matched the odd pyjama bottoms Jew had found. Dr. Spilsbury concluded that the scar on a small piece of skin was over a year old and certainly from an operation performed on the lower abdomen. The police surgeon, Dr. Marshall, also repeated what the 2 doctors had stated. The defence had their own doctors, both of whom denied the marking could possibly be a scar. On the actual cause of death, Dr. William Wilcox had tested the viscera of the corpse and found traces of hyoscine hydrobromide, a drug which is a powerful narcotic poison. In this case, it must have been taken orally. The patient would become drowsy and unconscious and completely paralysed, depending on the amount given. Death would result in a few hours. Chemist Charles Hetherington knew Crippen as they both worked on the same street, and Crippen did use the pharmacy often. On the 17th and 18th of January, Crippen purchased 5 grains of hyoscine hydrobromide, saying he was using it for homeopathic reasons. This was the first time he had bought the hyoscine. The defence relied on witnesses that knew him, and all spoke of him as a very nice, amiable man with a kind heart, and how if someone had done something so terrible, surely their manner would have changed. They wouldn't be able to carry on as normal. But Crippen acted like he always did. They didn't see any change in him. Tobin said that people left all the time, marriages break down. Mrs. Crippen left, nobody knows where she was. It doesn't mean that she was dead. Tobin claimed the Hyoscene was bought and prepared for some obstinate cases, those who suffered with nerves. None of this could be proved. When Crippen took to the stand, he stuck to his story that Cora had left when he returned home from work at his normal time of 7:30 p.m. She had just gone. He then explained his motives for saying Cora had died. He said he admitted to Jew that he had lied. When asked why he had lied, he said Cora had asked him to cover up the scandal. I wanted to hide anything regarding her departure from me the best I could, for both our sakes, he said. Crippen said he had told Jew the truth, but Jew told him it was imperative that he produce his wife or he could be in serious trouble. Jew, Crippen claimed, had told him if he doesn't produce his wife quickly, his statements would be in all the newspapers the next day. So he made his mind up to leave for Quebec. Apparently, a disgusted Jew vigorously denied saying anything like that. Crippen had lied under oath, just as he had to Cora's friends. He went to great pains to point out that Leneve didn't know anything, only that Cora had left him and had died later from an illness. When Crippen was asked about the remains found in his house, he said he knew nothing about them. On cross-examination, Muir asked him if anyone at all had seen or heard of Mrs. Crippen since the Martinettis last saw her after the dinner party. He replied no. Could anyone prove she'd even left the house? No. Did he know of any person in the world had seen her alive? No. Do you know of any person in the world who had received a letter from her? No. But you made no inquiries? No. You made no inquiries at all, knowing that it could help your case? I made no inquiries. He didn't even ask Dew, when told he was being charged with his wife's murder, how she had died. He didn't show. The same pyjamas that had been found with the remains had been sold to Crippen, the retailer would confirm. It was also discovered that the pyjamas were not supplied until after 1908, so the remains, along with the pyjama top, could only have been put there after that date, and it's during the time the Crippens lived there. Did Crippen know how they got there? No, he said, he didn't. Crippen claimed to have decided to leave the day Dew and Mitchell came to see him, claiming he thought he'd be sitting in jail for months or even a year until they found his wife. When the cross came from Mr. Muir, why would he think he would be in jail? Crippen answered he thought it would be because of suspicion. Continuing after a pause, Dew had said, "This woman must be found." Crippen's case was growing weaker. Muir pointed out that why did Crippen feel he had to write to Cora's friends if he thought she was just missing? How would he know that she hadn't or wasn't going to write to them herself? The cross-examination was going well. On closing, the defence said that Crippen's failure to look for his wife was because he was happy to be rid of her, as it meant he and Miss Leneve could now be together. Tobin suggested Crippen didn't really care where his wife had gone. They claimed that Crippen couldn't have taken his wife's life on the 1st of February, then went to work on the next day as usual, before returning to dispose of the body the way it had been described, then tidy up and regain his composure before Miss Leneve arrived. To save face for both he and his wife, he decided the best way to avoid a scandal was to say she had left for America and then unfortunately died of an illness. Tobin claimed the letters were an act of kindness to hide Mrs. Crippen's shame. Why did they run? He said. They were afraid. Lastly, Tobin made it clear to the jury that the remains hadn't been identified as a female, let alone Mrs. Crippen. The prosecution played heavily on the fact that Crippen was a liar, in fact a compulsive liar, i.e. the letters he had sent to Cora's friends and about her death. How he even sent a letter to her family telling Cora was no longer alive. The distraught family told of how he had even wrote it on black-edged paper. Why would you even think to do that when you thought she may still be alive somewhere in America? Then there was the fact he failed to mention he was the one who was being unfaithful, but made a great hue and cry about thinking Cora was having an affair with Bruce Miller, which was apparently absurd as they hadn't even seen each other for 6 years. Muir added, although they didn't definitely know that the remains found were that of Cora, there was more than enough evidence to point to the fact she was now deceased. The hair strands found with the remains were of dark colour and bleached blonde, and we know that Cora used to dye her hair. The scar on the abdomen could point to Cora, as she had an operation there sometime between 1892 and 93, which her half-sister attested to at court. Then there is the hyacinth Crippen purchased, but couldn't provide proof of where he had used it in his work, and the remains had traces of it still inside. And then, obviously, there was the pyjama top. The whole trial lasted 5 days. The jury was sent out after instructions from the judge. 27 minutes later, they returned with a guilty verdict. Crippen remained composed and protested his innocence. Judge Lord Elverston passed sentence on Crippen. Dr. Harvey Crippen was hung at Pentonville Prison on the 23rd of November 1910 and is buried in the prison cemetery. What happened to the head, bones and limbs of the remains would never be known. The case was worldwide news and made Crippen infamous throughout the world. He was seen as one of the most evil and dangerous men ever, with his name becoming synonymous with the likes of Jack the Ripper. However, 2 weeks before he was hanged, he wrote, "I am innocent, and someday evidence will be found to prove it." Ethel Leneve went to court on Tuesday the 25th of October 1910. She was charged with assisting Crippen to escape justice at a time he was suspected of taking the life of his wife. Leneve pled not guilty, stating she knew nothing of Mrs. Crippen's death. According to her defence, Crippen had told her the same story he had told Dew, but Dew had noted when arrested she didn't make any remark or any statement. This in itself felt to Dew she knew more than she claimed. But there was little to go on, and Ethel Leneve was found not guilty and released. However, about a year later it was discovered by chance that Leneve had forged Cora's signature to obtain money from Cora's post office savings account between April and June 1910. They decided not to prosecute. Apparently Ethel married and had 2 children. But there are different stories as to what happened to her after the trial, so I'll just say, after some investigative work from an author, it was found that Ethel had married a Stanley Smith in Wandsworth. Ethel Smith had passed away in 1967, aged 84, at Dulwich Hospital, taking her secrets to the grave with her.